The one thing I am asked for most by my community is how to create good builds. In this, the first video in the series, I'm going to show you how to maximize your weapon damage. Let's look at this Vector submachine gun. Per the UI, this gun does 83.9k total damage. But how does the game get to this number, and how does it relate to the actual damage I do? There are two things that go into this. Firstly, there is the base damage of the weapon. In order to see what this is for a weapon, you need to toggle it on. To do this, select the weapon, then options, and then change show base damage to on. This base damage is now shown in the weapon's core stats as a white number. For this SMG, it is 38.3k. This base damage is then buffed by 45.6k to get to the total damage. Where this buff comes from is key to maximizing your weapon damage output. Firstly, gear can be rolled with a weapon damage, armor or skill tier core, red, blue or yellow. Each red core buffs the base damage by 15%. The more red cores, the higher the buff to the weapon's damage. This build has 4 red cores which will add 60%. All SMGs come with up to 15% SMG damage. If you are lucky, your weapon will drop with this stat maxed out. But more likely than not, you will need to optimize its stats, something I will cover in a separate video. Gear can come with weapon damage on it. The Walker Harris, Jarl, Legatus and Hanayu brand sets and the Tip of the Spear and Virtuosa gear sets come with weapon damage bonuses that apply to every weapon type. While Aurodi, Badger Tough, Douglas and Harding, Fenris, Habsburg, Lingmo, Overlord, Petrov Defense, Sokolov and Swidalka brand sets, and Aces and Eights, Breaking Point, Heartbreaker, Hotshot and Hunter's Fury gear sets have weapon specific damage bonuses. And then there is the named Picaro's Holster, which is the only piece of gear that comes with weapon damage as an attribute. For this build I'm running one piece of Petrov Defense in the form of the named Contractor's Gloves, but this buffs LMG damage so won't be buffing the base damage of my Vector at all. At level 40 all agents get Keena's Watch and access to the Shade level system. Make sure that you level up the watch to 1000 for its buff to defense, skills, weapon handling and offense, which includes 10% weapon damage. We also have a specialization. With all specializations you get to buff the damage of 3 weapon types by 15%, so make sure you have selected the weapon type you're using. Finally, there is Expertise, which was introduced into the game in 2022. This is made up of 2 types of progression systems, expertise level and proficiency rank. Nearly every weapon, gear and skill has a proficiency rank, which can be increased through donations of duplicate items or materials and kill XP. Expertise level is a function of the proficiency ranks of all items. Once an item reaches max proficiency, it can be upgraded to the current expertise level. For the Vector I'm using, it has been upgraded to expertise level 19, and so gets a 19% weapon damage buff. There are 2 other buffs that will impact on the total damage number, both of which are variable and so you don't typically see them when you open up your inventory in the base of operations. Firstly, there are 1 or 2 talents on gear that buff weapon damage. The weapon talent Optimist, for example. Now you might think that there are lots, but this is where things start to get a little complicated and opaque. The wording of talents is incredibly important. Let's have a look at the backpack talent Vigilance as an example. At a glance, it looks like it is buffing weapon damage by 25%. In fact, those are the words that Massive decided to highlight, but actually what this is buffing is total weapon damage, which is a completely separate damage modifier. I'm going to talk about all the different damage modifiers, and there are quite a lot of them later in this video, but as you can see, the total damage of my Vector is unchanged by equipping this talent. That's the complication. The opaqueness comes from inaccurate or misleading tooltips, which you can only find out from testing. Take the Bloody Knuckles. According to its tooltip, damaging an enemy with a grenade should result in 25% buff to weapon damage, so not total weapon damage. Let's proc its talent with a grenade. There you can see that it's procced from the icon shown, but when we look at my Vector, it's still showing the same total damage. And this is true of nearly all of the gear talents that refer to weapon damage. The only one that I'm aware of that does buff the total damage of the weapon is the exotic Memento backpack. When wearing this backpack, every enemy that I kill drops a kill confirmed trophy. These trophies deliver a short term and a long term buff. The long term buff gives me 1% weapon damage for every trophy I pick up to a max of 30 stacks. And you can see here that when I am at max stacks, the total damage of my Vector has increased to 95.4k. The other variable buff are seasonal modifiers. Now given that these will change every season, I'm not going to cover them in this video. It's time to put all of this together. So the base damage of the Vector is 38.3k. This is then increased by 60% from red weapon damage cores, 15% from the SMG damage on the Vector, 0% from gear bonuses, 10% from Keener's Watch, 15% from my specialization, 19% from the expertise on the weapon, and this totals 119% in total from weapon damage, to get to a 45.6k damage uplift. So that leaves me with that total damage before talents and seasonal modifiers of 83.9k. Now if we also added in the 30% from Memento max stacks, which is 11.5k, we get to that total damage including Memento stacks of 95.4k that we saw. So now you have everything you need to understand how a weapon's total damage number is calculated, and also how to maximize it. For many casual players, the rest of this video might be a bit more than they're looking for, as it goes into somewhat complicated topics. So this is the perfect time for you to hit the subscribe button. YouTube algorithm is fucking weird. If you do want to see further episodes in this series, then subscribing is your best option. Otherwise, you might never see one of these videos again. It's now time to crack out the spreadsheets, because when I fire this weapon, it actually hits for 200.3k some of the time and 99.6k the rest of the time. So not the 83.9k total damage you might have expected. And that's because the total damage shown for a weapon is just one part of how damage is calculated in the Division 2. Here are all the damage modifiers which buff our damage output. Weapon damage is what drives the total damage on our weapon, which we've just been looking at. Total weapon damage, which can be found on gear talents like the Vigilance talent. Again, always check the wording of these talents, as they aren't always obvious, but they are very important. Critical hit damage and headshot damage, which can be found as attributes on weapons and gear, from mods that you can fit onto your weapon and gear, and from bonuses on brand sets and gear sets, and from talents on weapons and gear. Damage to targets out of cover comes as a core attribute on LMGs. It can be rolled as the third attribute on all other weapons, and on the named Fox's Prayer knee pads. Damage to armor comes as a core attribute on shotguns, can be rolled as the third attribute on all other weapons, comes from the bonuses on the Araldi and Walker Harris brand sets, and on the named Contractor's gloves. Damage to health comes as a core attribute on assault rifles, can be rolled as the third attribute on all other weapons, from the bonuses on the Walker Harris brand set and on the named Hollow Man mask. And finally, amplified damage, which comes from talents on gears and weapons, and like rules of engagement on the ongoing directive gear set that I'm using in this build. I'm going to use the build we were looking at before to show you how these modifiers are applied. If we look at the stats of this build, we can see that it has 101% critical hit damage, 70% headshot damage, 8% damage to armor, which comes from the named Contractor's gloves, and 0% health damage. The talent on the ongoing directive gear set does grant me hollow point ammo when killing a marked enemy, which amplifies weapon damage, but for now we won't be proccing this. I also won't be proccing the talent on the Vector, Sadist, which also amplifies weapon damage. Finally, for this test I will be running the build with no Memento stacks. The way that damage works in the Division 2 is that the base weapon damage is increased by each damage multiplier, and these damage multipliers are multiplicative with each other. So the damage I would expect to be dealing with the Vector I'm using is as follows. The base damage of 38.3k, multiplied by the 119% weapon damage, 8% damage to armor, 10% damage to targets out of cover, and 0% amplified damage to give a non-critical damage per shot of 99.6k. Layer in the 101% critical hit damage and we get to a critical hit damage per shot of 200.3k. And these are the exact amounts I see in the range when I shoot an enemy with armor. It's worth noting that while an enemy has armor, the damage to armor multiplier will be in effect. But once it breaks, any damage to health multiplier will be in effect. You can't benefit from both of these buffs at the same time. You can see this when I crack the armor in the range and my damage drops as I don't have any damage to health on this build. Next, I'm going to proc the ongoing directive talent, which will also proc the sadist talent on my vector. The ongoing directive talent amplifies my damage by 50%, and sadist adds a further 30% amplified damage. Before I show you what the vector is now hitting for, this is what we might think the calculation will show. So the base damage of 38.3k multiplied by the 190% weapon damage, the 8% damage to armor, the 10% damage to target's outer cover, and a total of 80% amplified damage to get to a non-critical damage per shot of 179.4k, and a critical damage per shot of 360.5k. As you can see, I'm actually hitting for higher than we expected. And the reason for this is that every source of amplified damage is a separate damage multiplier. So the correct calculation is the base damage of 38.3k multiplied by 119% weapon damage, 8% damage to armor, 10% damage to target's outer cover, 50% amplified damage from the ongoing directive gear set, 30% amplified damage from the sadist talent, to give a non-critical damage per shot of 194.3 and a critical damage per shot of 390.6, which is exactly what we saw in the range. Splitting the amplified damage multiplier into two smaller multipliers results in a significantly higher damage output. There are two very important things to take away from this. Firstly, it's better to have lots of smaller damage multipliers than it is to have just one or two larger ones. Secondly, sources of amplified damage always treated as separate damage multipliers, so always multiplicative, making them the best sources of damage multipliers. Before I talk about how to maximize the damage for this build, I just wanted to show you how the calculation works for headshot damage. Headshot damage is additive within the critical hit damage multiplier, which leads to two separate calculations for a non-critical and critical hit. This build has 70% headshot damage, so the calculation for a non-critical and critical headshot is as follows. Now you know the weapon damage calculation, probably still isn't that clear on how you'd then maximize your weapon damage output if you could make changes to this build. To be able to do that, you need to understand the concept of diminishing returns, and I can show you exactly what this is with the following example. Let's assume I could increase the weapon damage buff in this build by 10% to 129%. This changes the multiplier from 2.19 to 2.29, which is actually only a 4.6% increase in the multiplier. Compare this to a 10% increase in our damage to target's outer cover buff, and this changes the multiplier from 1.1 to 1.2, which is a 9.1% increase in the multiplier. So increasing the smallest multiplier has the biggest impact on our damage output, and the smallest multiplier will always be a brand new source of amplified damage, as this would be increasing its multiplier from 1 to 1.1, the full 10% increase. I've given you a lot of information in this video, and hopefully now you realise why I'm doing a series of videos and not just one mammoth one to cover everything. To finish up, I wanted to leave you with these simple rules to follow so you can maximise your weapon damage output when you hit level 40. Firstly, get to shade level 1000 to maximise the buffs Kino Watch provides. Make sure your specialisation weapon buff is set to the right weapon. Spread your damage buffs over as many damage multipliers as possible. Amplified damage buffs are always a new damage multiplier, making them excellent sources of damage buff. And when making changes to a build, increase smallest buffs and reduce the largest first. Thanks for watching this video all the way to the end. Check out episode 2, in which I will be covering skill related damage coming soon.